The moment systems begin to fail, it will not look like a dramatic collapse, it will look like absence. A shelf not restocked, a delivery delayed by 3 days, a quiet substitution in packaging that signals something deeper has shifted. And then almost imperceptibly, food itself begins to change, not in taste, not in quality, but in availability, in predictability, in the hidden architecture that once ensured its constant presence. This is where the real danger begins, because human survival is not threatened first by starvation, but by disruption in expectation. The body can endure hunger far longer than the mind can endure uncertainty. And yet most people prepare for collapse by stockpiling food in ways that ignore the most critical variables: time, degradation, metabolic efficiency, and system fragility. The assumption that survival is about quantity is the first and most dangerous misunderstanding. People fill rooms with packaged goods, believing volume equals security, unaware that food is not a static resource. It is a dynamic system governed by chemistry, microbiology, and environmental interaction. Calories degrade, nutrients oxidize, packaging fails at the microscopic level long before it visibly breaks. The real question is not how much food you have, but how long that food remains biologically useful under non-ideal conditions. Because when infrastructure collapses, storage conditions collapse with it. Temperature fluctuates, humidity rises, light exposure increases, and every one of these variables accelerates entropy within your food supply. To understand the hidden system of food stockpiling, you must first understand that food is not merely fuel. It is a biochemical input that interacts with the human body in complex ways. Macronutrients provide energy, but micronutrients regulate the processes that allow that energy to be used. A stockpile heavy in calories but deficient in essential vitamins becomes a slow failure mechanism. Deficiencies in vitamin C, B-complex vitamins, and electrolytes do not kill immediately, but they degrade cognitive function, immune response, and physical endurance. In a collapsed environment, these are the first systems you cannot afford to lose. The mistake is assuming that survival equals staying alive. In reality, survival requires maintaining function. The hidden science begins with stability. Not all foods degrade at the same rate, and not all degradation is visible. Lipids oxidize, creating rancidity that reduces caloric efficiency and introduces harmful compounds. Proteins denature, losing their structural integrity and digestibility. Carbohydrates, especially simple sugars, can crystallize or ferment under certain conditions, altering their metabolic availability. Even water content plays a critical role, because moisture enables microbial growth, and microbes do not need ideal conditions, they only need opportunity. This is why traditional preservation methods, developed long before industrial food systems, focused on controlling water activity, not just preventing spoilage. Evidence of this can be found in the longest-lasting food systems ever created. Grains stored in low-oxygen environments have remained viable for decades, even centuries. Honey, with its low water activity and natural antimicrobial properties, resists degradation almost indefinitely. Salted and dried foods, when properly prepared, create environments hostile to bacteria and fungi. These are not accidental discoveries, they are the result of empirical understanding of how biological systems interact with environmental constraints. Modern packaging attempts to replicate these conditions artificially, but it is dependent on intact supply chains and controlled storage. Remove those, and the system begins to fail. The survival implications are immediate and severe. A stockpile that appears sufficient on day one can become nutritionally compromised within months if not structured correctly. This is where the concept of the forbidden system emerges, not because it is secret, but because it contradicts the dominant narrative of convenience. The system is based on layering, redundancy, and metabolic prioritization. It requires thinking of food not as individual items, but as an integrated network of resources that support each other. Staples provide baseline calories, preserved proteins maintain muscle function, fermentable foods support gut microbiota, which in turn affects immunity and nutrient absorption. This interconnected approach is rarely discussed because it is complex, and complexity does not sell. As conditions worsen, the gap between those who understand the system and those who do not begins to widen. Initial shortages create panic buying, which disrupts distribution even further. People gravitate toward familiar foods, depleting certain categories while leaving others untouched. This creates imbalances not only in the market but in individual stockpiles. High-calorie, low-nutrient foods become overrepresented, while essential components like minerals and vitamins become scarce. The irony is that in an environment of apparent abundance, shelves still partially stocked, supplies still technically available, nutritional collapse can already be underway. This escalation is not hypothetical, it is a predictable outcome of how human systems respond under stress. The more pressure applied to the supply chain, the more it prioritizes efficiency over resilience. Just-in-time delivery systems designed to minimize waste and maximize profit eliminate the buffers that once absorbed shocks. When those buffers disappear, even minor disruptions cascade into major shortages. And because modern populations are disconnected from food production, there is no immediate fallback. The knowledge required to adapt has been outsourced, forgotten, or dismissed as obsolete. But the most critical failure is psychological. People prepare for scenarios they can imagine, not for systems they do not understand. They envision empty shelves but not the gradual erosion of nutritional quality. They anticipate scarcity but not imbalance. They focus on survival in isolation, rather than survival as a function of biological systems interacting with environmental constraints. This is why the forbidden system remains overlooked. It requires a shift in perspective from accumulation to optimization. And as the first signs of real disruption begin to appear, not dramatic, not catastrophic, but subtle and persistent, the question is no longer whether you have enough food, but whether your food can sustain you in a world where nothing else is stable. Because the true collapse does not begin when food disappears. It begins when food stops working the way you think it does. What ultimately determines survival is not the moment you begin to feel hunger, but the moment your body begins to fail silently under the weight of imbalance, depletion, and biochemical inefficiency. By the time this becomes visible, through fatigue that does not recover, through wounds that do not heal, through cognition that begins to slow, the underlying system has already been compromised for weeks, sometimes months. This is the final stage of misunderstanding, where individuals believe they are enduring when in reality they are declining. And it is here that the full consequence of an improperly designed food stockpile reveals itself, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as an irreversible drift toward dysfunction. The final layer of the hidden system is control over variability. In stable conditions, human metabolism adapts to fluctuations in diet with relative ease. But under stress, caloric restriction, dehydration, temperature extremes, this adaptive capacity narrows. The body begins to prioritize immediate survival over long-term stability, consuming muscle tissue, reducing immune response, and altering hormone production to conserve energy. This is not a sustainable state, it is an emergency mode. And if the food system feeding into that body is inconsistent, high in one nutrient, deficient in another, the stress compounds. The system becomes chaotic, and chaos in biological systems accelerates failure. One of the least understood mechanisms in this process is electrolyte balance. Sodium, potassium, magnesium, these are not optional components. They are the regulators of nerve function, muscle contraction, and fluid distribution. A stockpile heavy in processed carbohydrates but lacking in mineral diversity creates a hidden vulnerability. As glycogen stores are depleted and replenished irregularly, electrolyte shifts become more pronounced. Cramping, dizziness, irregular heartbeat, these are not isolated symptoms but indicators that the internal environment is destabilizing. In a controlled setting, this can be corrected quickly. In a collapsed environment without access to diverse food sources, it becomes a compounding risk. The same principle applies to protein utilization. It is not enough to consume protein. It must be digestible and supported by adequate micronutrients to be metabolized effectively. Without sufficient vitamin B6, for example, amino acid metabolism is impaired. Without adequate zinc, immune function declines even if caloric intake remains sufficient. These are the hidden dependencies within the system, interactions that are rarely considered in conventional preparation strategies. Food is treated as independent units, when in reality it functions as a network of interdependent variables. Historical evidence reinforces this pattern. Populations that experienced prolonged supply disruptions did not always suffer from immediate starvation, they suffered from nutritional collapse. Diets became monotonous, dominated by a few available staples. Caloric intake remained marginally adequate but deficiencies accumulated. Diseases associated with malnutrition, scurvy, pellagra, beriberi, emerged not because food was absent but because food lacked diversity. These conditions are not relics of the past, they are predictable outcomes of any system that prioritizes quantity over balance. The forbidden system counters this by enforcing rotational diversity and functional redundancy. It is not enough to store multiple types of food, those foods must be cycled, tested, and integrated into daily consumption long before any disruption occurs. This serves two purposes. First, it ensures that the stockpile remains within its optimal stability window, reducing the risk of degradation. Second, it trains the body to operate efficiently on the available resources, minimizing shock when conditions change. Adaptation is not something that can be initiated at the moment of crisis. It must be built gradually through repeated exposure and adjustment. As external systems continue to degrade, Transportation networks slowing, energy availability fluctuating, economic signals distorting, the pressure on individual preparation increases. The margin for error narrows. Small inefficiencies that would be negligible in stable conditions become critical. Wasted calories, spoiled food, missed nutrient targets, each one compounds over time, eroding the resilience of the entire system. And because these failures are incremental, they are often ignored until they reach a threshold where correction is no longer possible. This is the final escalation, the realization that survival is not a static achievement, but a continuous process of management. The stockpile is not a reserve to be consumed passively. It is an active system that requires monitoring, adjustment, and understanding. Every item within it has a lifespan, a function, and a set of dependencies. Ignoring any of these variables introduces risk. Understanding them transforms the stockpile from a liability into a controlled environment. And yet, even with complete understanding, the system is never perfect. There will always be variables outside your control: environmental shifts, unforeseen disruptions, biological responses that deviate from expectation. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty but to reduce its impact, to create a system that absorbs shocks rather than amplifies them, to ensure that when external stability disappears, internal stability remains intact for as long as possible. Because in the end, collapse is not defined by the absence of resources. It is defined by the failure to use those resources effectively. Food does not guarantee survival. Only the correct application of food within a functioning biological system does. And that system, complex, fragile, and unforgiving, operates whether you understand it or not. The difference is that understanding gives you time. And in any collapsing system, time is the only resource that cannot be replenished.